Good evening. Good afternoon. I guess it's on the cusp of evening. Welcome, TGS community. Students, parents, family members, community members, staff members, board members, you are all here because you are members of our community. Did you know? You are. So we want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Jen Wilger. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Temple Grandin School, and we are delighted to have you all here with us tonight. Before we get underway, I wanted to say some thank yous to some people who have worked really hard to make this event happen. To our event committee, Leanne Paskvalich, Jason Lynch, myself, and Karen Williams. So we had a couple staff and a couple board running the show, and it went really well. We have some sponsors, and I hope you noticed their information circulating on our screen. Davis, Graham, and Stubbs, big thank you to them as our premier sponsor. Zoni's Law, new coming on to the community this year. Trimble, Cable Labs, and our friends at TACT, Teaching Autism Community Trades. We're really excited to have them as a part of this evening and look forward to more collaborations with them in the future. We also have some individuals and organizations that have helped just kind of with the nuts and bolts of making this a nice event for you all. Isn't this a great venue here at eTown? The staff here has been amazing and helped us with everything we could possibly need. The catering by Frasca Food and Wine, D&K Printing, what you have in your hands to follow along with. They donated that. BC Interiors for our lovely set stage up here. The Hotel Boulder has treated our out-of-town guests very well and I believe upgraded their accommodations, so we hope those are as promised. Boulder Bookstore will be here this evening immediately following this presentation, so if you want to purchase books by any of the speakers, they have been taking care of that. All the way down to the video, the photos, Scott Scheck Photography, and Kelly Doyle, one of our parents, has graciously arranged all of our flowers for the evening. So let's give all those folks a warm round of applause. Great. So tonight we're going to be exploring the themes of neurodiversity in community. And I just wanted to talk for a moment about community and how that has come to express itself in Temple Grandin School. Before the Temple Grandin School was a reality, as we know it today, for the past 6 years, it was already kind of a dream in my own mind about community. It was about a community that supported me, my husband, our family, and our son on our own Asperger journey, about those people who came around us and became champions for our son. From the very, very beginning, before I had ever heard of Asperger's, definitely before I knew how to spell Asperger's. But now, thanks to folks like Temple and John and Steve and the people you'll be hearing from tonight, you all know at least a little bit about Asperger's and autism, and hopefully you will be learning more tonight. And you can start by studying for the spelling test. Just kidding. Actually, the diagnosis of Asperger's is no longer officially a part of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, Edition 5. If you want to learn more about the history of Asperger's, which is fascinating, and how it has made its way in and out of our diagnostic landscape, you'll want to check out Steve's book, Neurotribes. It's a big, fat book with a lot of juicy, good stuff in it. If you want to understand why we still include in our collection of terms that describe our students, Asperger's, autism, you'll want to spend some time with Temple or John, either in person or by checking out their books. That will give you an inspiring glance into their minds that are different, but not less. So we're here to talk about community and how neurodiversity flows through and enriches it. Community is a core value for us at Temple Grandin School. Our kids recognize it when they feel it, and many of them express it when they first walk into our doors, even as visiting students. They feel like this is a community where I can be safe, I can be comfortable, this is a place where I belong, this is a place where people understand me. So I wanted to give you a chance to hear a little bit from some students about their experience at Temple Grandin School. I'm going to step aside and they're going to play a little video, and then I will wrap us up and turn the stage over.
I think the most unique thing about Temple Grandin School is that the people here get my kid.
Temple Grandin School is a safe and supportive place.
If you don't know a kid with Asperger's, you're not really sure what to expect.
They think about things in a different way.
They just really need to feel like they are understood.
They need a place where they can really spend time diving into their areas of interest.
I do. I bring my plants to school occasionally. This plant that I brought in is little cymbidium. What I want to be when I grow up is probably a botanist, because I just adore plants and they can help in so many ways.
The community of learners that we've created is so supportive of each other.
It's just really different, and I have better grades now and there's no bullying. I just like it a lot better here.
I've probably only been to use like once here, and that's in comparison to like every day at my old school.
And there's a lot of trying to help each other out. They don't always do it very well.
Kids help each other, sometimes awkwardly, but sometimes not awkwardly, sometimes beautifully.
So it's easier to make friends with other Aspies because they have the same social problems that I do.
Teachers are flexible and committed.
Passionate, incredibly passionate.
A teacher needs to be kind, understanding to some degree, and have a very flexible mindset.
Everyone is interested in seeing you succeed, and there's lots of different goals for different people. But I think whatever your goal is, everyone here is working as best they can to help you get there.
And the big difference I see since he started at Temple Grandin School is the realization that he's got value and that he can succeed.
We accept each kid for who they are and where they are, and they are not all in the same place, and some of them are challenging on some days.
And I think the parents appreciate the fact that we are here every day with a consistent positive outlook on their kids' future.
Things for me started to go downhill when I went to middle school, and this has really helped pick me back up.
And we create a space where they can learn the functional skills in the areas that they're not as strong in, but they can really just dive in and wholeheartedly take advantage of their natural talents and gifts.
Math and science are my biggest strengths.
The school's motto is grow from your strength, and I think that's exactly what it's doing for me and a lot of the other people here.
Yes, you are definitely free to be who you are at this school, no doubt.
They don't have to be normal, whatever normal is, to make a contribution to the world, and I believe that these kids are going to do great things. Those are our kids. One of them was my kid. They're all my kids now, and they're all of our kids. Community is not accidental at Temple Grandin School or beyond our walls. Community is built intentionally when we acknowledge our shared humanity and embrace the differences that make us each unique and make our community richer. Neurodiversity is here to stay, and we're here tonight to help each other understand and celebrate it. We hope tonight's program inspires you to consider how you can join with us and join together with each other here in Colorado and beyond to build an inclusive, empowering community that will endure. Our world needs community now, maybe more than ever, and we all want to be part of that. So welcome to our evening. With that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and our moderator. Jason Lynch, our board chair, will be moderating, and he actually will be introducing our panelists.
Thank you all very much for being here tonight. It is a thrill, it's a joy for us to have you join us. I want to add my welcome on behalf of the Temple Grandin School Board of Directors. I'm the current chair of the board. I'm also the parent of a student at Temple Grandin School, so I know firsthand the wondrous things that Jen and her team can do. Our mission at Temple Grandin School is to work with families to develop the abilities and independence of students with Asperger's so that they can thrive in the 21st century. Another important part of our mission is to further dialogue and understanding about neurodiversity in our community, and that's what tonight is about. I'd like to invite you, before we begin, to join us and support us in our mission in two ways. One thing I'd like to ask is for you to consider supporting Temple Grandin School with financial support. If you open up the back of your program tonight, on the last page, you'll see a link to a fundraising page where we continue to raise money to broaden our program, to fuel the education of our children, to inspire our staff, and to work toward a goal that we're working on right now to building a permanent home, a permanent campus for the Temple Grandin School for decades to come. Importantly tonight, I want to acknowledge there's an anonymous donor out there this evening who has made a matching grant of $5,000. If you make a donation to that gift page in the next several days, that donor is going to match that donation dollar for dollar up to $5,000. So I wanted to thank that person and acknowledge them. I know who you are, you know who you are, but I hope the rest of you will see that as an opportunity to, let me take that from you. Take that as an opportunity to supercharge a gift that you might make, so consider that. The other thing I'd like to invite you to consider is joining the Temple Grandin School Board of Directors. As our school matures, we're growing our board and we're looking for committed individuals with a variety of experiences and skill sets, marketing, technology, education, not-for-profit management. If you think that might be something you're interested in, please, before you leave tonight, see me or Jen Wilger. We have some information packets that we can share with you, and we'd love to see if that's something that you'd like to join us for. And as Jen mentioned, when we conclude here this evening, we invite you all to join us downstairs in the cafe for a kind of wrap-up reception, to spend some time one-on-one with our speakers, and to purchase books and have them signed, if you'd like. So with that, I'd like to invite our three panelists up on the stage. Temple, John, and Steve, please come on up. Make yourselves comfortable. So before we begin, let me just do some quick introductions, if I might. I think many of you or most of you know the background of our speakers, but we have to say a few words, and we have to begin with the incomparable Dr. Temple Grandin. Named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2010. Author of books like The Autistic Brain, Thinking in Pictures, The Way I See It, and Different Not Less. She has a PhD in animal science and is a professor at Colorado State University. She serves as a consultant whose insights have changed the way that the livestock and animal handling industries do their work. And the HBO movie on her life, starring Claire Danes, won 7 Emmy Awards. You can't top that. So thank you. Welcome, Temple. On Temple's left, I'd like to welcome John Elder Robison. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Look Me in the Eye. He also wrote Switched On, Raising Cubby, and Be Different. He's a noted speaker and consultant on autism, accommodation, disability policy, and employment and education strategy. He is the Neurodiversity Scholar in Residence at the College of William and Mary. He is a member and a subcommittee chair of the Interagency Coordinating Committee at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Forward to talking about that tonight.
We've got a super successful car business.
Yep.
A super successful car business.
And I think that's really, really important because work is such, we got to get these kids learning how to work.
And we're going to talk about that tonight for sure.
That's right.
Temple is right. You know, with all of the work that I do in autism advocacy, I always go back to our car business, and I still run it every day. So that's absolutely right.
You are also, though, a self-taught audio and electrical engineer who created special effects for bands like Kiss and Pink Floyd in your younger years.
That's right.
And anyone who would like to keep up with John's regular thinking on living with Asperger's, he writes an amazing blog, My Life with Asperger's, on psychologytoday.com. So check that out. Welcome, John. And to John's left, Steve Silberman, welcome. He is an award-winning science writer whose work has appeared in Wired, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Nature, Salon, the MIT Technology Review. He is the author, of course, of the New York Times bestseller Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. If you haven't read Neurotribes, it reports the secret history of the evolution of our understanding of what autism and Asperger's is, and it is told in an incredibly human and moving way. It's a wonderful book. John's writing on science, culture, and literature is collected in major anthologies like the Best American Science Writing of the Year and the Best Business Stories of the Year. He didn't want me to mention that he has a gold record from the Recording Industry Association of America for co-producing the Grateful Dead's career-spanning box set, So Many Roads. What he wanted me to tell you is that
in other words, I have no practical skills whatsoever.
You will be featured in Martin Scorsese's soon-to-be-released 4-hour documentary about the Grateful Dead.
That's true.
Okay. Very good. And finally, Steve is an old Boulder hand. As a young man, he worked as a teaching assistant with Allen Ginsberg at Naropa University in the 70s. So welcome back to Boulder.
Thank you. Thank you. This morning, I had the extreme pleasure of going up to the sorority house where 40 years ago, I got the note from Ginsberg saying that I could become a student of his. And so that was a really moving visit to me this morning.
Well, and is that where your writing career began?
Yes, in a way. In Kappa Alpha Theta House up on the,
up on the hill.
Up on the hill. Yep.
Well, where I wanted to start tonight was with the word neurodiversity, which didn't exist 20 years ago. And most people hadn't heard of it until it appeared in the title of your book in 2015, I think popularly anyway.
Yeah.
Can you tell the story of where that word came from?
Sure. Well, one of the places that autistic adults started talking to each other was online. And there was an early pre-web online community called Independent Living on the Autism Spectrum. And in the late 90s, there were two people there, Judy Singer, who was a graduate student in Australia, and Harvey Bloom, a journalist. And Judy had been mentored by a guy who had survived polio and lived in a wheelchair. And he sort of turned her on to what's called the social model of disability, which is that if you live in a wheelchair in a town where there are no wheelchair ramps or accessible classrooms or anything, you're really disabled. But if you live in a town where there are those accommodations, you're less disabled. And so she started to think about cognitive disabilities like autism and ADHD and dyslexia in the same way within the social model. Previous to that, really the only way that autism was ever thought of was within the strict medical model. It was a syndrome, it was a checklist of deficits and dysfunctions. It was not just different but less, And so she started to think there should be a word so that autistic people, like the people in this group, can talk about who they are without automatically medicalizing and pathologizing their lives. And so she coined the word neurodiversity and hoped that it would spread through the community of people with cognitive disabilities in the same way that slogans like Black is beautiful and gay is good had spread through other marginalized and stigmatized communities. And most people don't even know about Judy Singer, but boy, did that word ever take off. And you're right, actually. In fact, in the British printing of my book, they didn't even use the word neurodiversity because the editor had never heard of it. And I said, you will hear of it, please do this, And I got sort of the ultimate British no in an email. It said, thank you for your understanding on this matter, you know. But anyway, so neurodiversity has become a rallying cry for young autistic self-advocates, and it's also a way for people to understand that autism is a natural variation, and that it's not just some weird plague that erupted in the 1990s or whatever. So it's an example of a word that really has changed the world.
So, John, your usage of neurodiversity, does it equal autism, or is it an umbrella for
It's an umbrella
more
for
than
lots
that?
of things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Everybody who marches to a different drummer, as Judy put it.
Mm-hmm. Temple and John, I wonder, would you be willing to share when you first in your lives came to understand or feel that you thought differently than people around you?
For me, it was a very gradual learning over a good number of years, because in the 60s and 70s, there were no books. I remember reading Rimland's first book. I'm a visual thinker. I talked about that in Thinking in Pictures. And when I first wrote Thinking in Pictures, I made the mistake of thinking that everybody with autism was a visual thinker. And then I remember some Amazon.com reviews, in fact, I write about it in The Autistic Brain, saying that's not so. So then I started interviewing people and finding out they were word thinkers. And a real insight came when I asked a speech therapist, right when I was writing Thinking in Pictures, think about a church steeple, and she just got these lines like this, a very vague generalized thing. I don't have that. And then later on, I discovered there was a third type, the pattern thinker, the mathematician, the engineer. And I've since found scientific studies on, not with autistic people, but with artists and engineers, that the art mind, like mine, and a more mathematical mind, they're real things, they exist. There's like 6 or 7 major papers on it, and a good number of them are referenced in The Autistic Brain. People ask me all the time about a single magic breakthrough. There isn't one. You keep learning more and more. I've had people tell me my talks at 60 were better than my talks at 50. You know, by doing, you keep learning. It's also bottom-up thinking, where you constantly add information to the database. And as you add more information to the database, you get better at thinking. That's why we got to get the kids out of the bedroom and get them out doing things.
Mm-hmm. John, when did you first come to understand that you thought differently than a lot of the people around you?
Well, I didn't have that idea until some years after I learned about being autistic, which happened when I'm 40. Even though I was doing engineering work for some of the biggest rock and roll bands there were in the 70s, and even as I was designing sound effects and such in Milton Bradley's video games and designing other industrial products, I believed what people said to me who knew about me, which was that I was not a real engineer, and any success I had was just the result of luck and bullshit. And because I didn't know math and I couldn't graduate from college, I was not a real anything. And with that thinking, I always assumed that the other engineers around me, most of whom I figured were real engineers, must be able to do everything I did better. And it is only now that, in my 60th year, I look back and I realize that relatively few engineers had the success that I did.
Don't have the visual creativity that you have.
Yeah, they did. That's the thing. I mean, they could do mathematics, but mathematics, frankly, isn't worth anything if you don't have the underlying ideas. And so
I'll tell you what Thomas Edison said. I just found this in a Thomas Edison biography. I'm not a mathematician. I can always hire some, but they can't hire me. That's what Thomas Edison said.
Well, that's great.
And I think Thomas Edison was on the spectrum. He was described as a hyperactive adult high school dropout.
That's really what I've come to see, that these people who criticized me for not knowing math, and therefore I couldn't be a real engineer. What I understand today is that I don't need the math they teach in college, because I taught myself to listen to musical instruments, and I taught myself what the waves from those instruments looked like. I taught myself how my circuits would change them, and I taught myself how to understand how the changed waves would sound. And I was able to combine and manipulate those waves in my head. And it may be that it takes somebody with a doctorate in mathematics to describe what my circuits did. But for me, I did it all in my imagination. And now what I understand is that calculus is a representational system to teach people who don't have it in their minds to do it on paper.
Well, you know what I'm concerned about? I'm really concerned that us sort of non-mathematicians are going to get screened out. I just got back from California. They got draconian algebra requirements. You can't graduate high school without algebra. You know what happened to me? I managed to get out of algebra, and I got into college on probation because mother bashed open the back door. And then in 66 and 67, algebra, thank goodness, wasn't a required class. It was finite math, probability, matrices, and statistics. And with some tutoring, I could do it. I'm very concerned that a lot of smart kids are getting screened out. And over here at these plants, back when JBS used to be Montfort, Cargill was Excel, I worked on those plants. I worked with millwrights that I know are on the spectrum. Brilliant guys. And you know what? They can't replace them because the kids that should be replacing them got an Asperger label and they're playing video games in the basement. And Tyson's got billboards on the highway right now advertising for industrial mechanics. They can't replace them.
Well, it's not just mathematics. I failed English in high school. And I realize now that it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't know adverbs and subjects and predicates, but now I understand that those are all terms that allow a teacher to represent the structure of language to someone who doesn't have the inborn ability to construct and use language.
You know how I learned? My elementary school teachers just went through and red marked it up, and then I went back and corrected it, and then I'd read it out loud. And fortunately, I was raised in a home where English was spoken properly. So I said, well, wait a minute, mother wouldn't say it like that. Diagramming a sentence didn't even make any sense to me. But that's how I learned how to write, because fortunately, I was in an environment where English was spoken correctly.
I think Temple and I were both very fortunate that we had educated parents, and we were in environments where clear, proper English was spoken, and we just learned how to speak and therefore how to write.
That's right.
And so to try and force us to use terminology that school teachers wish to use to teach the subject is counterproductive and destructive.
And what's important isn't how you learn how to write, the method used, it's the outcome.
It's whether you can speak and write.
Outcome and be able to write.
A New York Times bestselling book, for example.
Well, and I've got a New York Times bestseller too, Animals in Translation.
Yes, you do.
Okay.
That's right.
But you know, we didn't have that validation, I think, until we wrote books that were publicly acclaimed. And I think that's an example of how, at least for me, I grew up feeling that I was less than everyone else in those respects.
Well,
and it's only now
in the
that I know
70s,
that's not
when I
true.
designed the DipVat projects, one of the things that motivated me to do it is I wanted to prove I wasn't stupid.
Yeah.
Really wanted to prove that I was not stupid. No one thought I would amount to anything.
We sound really smart today, but the thing is, we didn't feel that way when we were 20 years old. I don't think either of us did. And I think we're really different, too. I think that if you look at video of Temple and me a decade ago, it's a kind of a remarkable thing because we're both at a point in our lives where many people are slowing down, and I think Temple and I are kind of getting sharper and better at this, and maybe that's the developmental delay aspect of autism.
But it's bottom-up thinking. It's bottom-up thinking. You see, I read your book on where you learned those circuits.
Yeah.
Not the first one, it was your second book.
Yeah.
And you experimented, and you changed the circuit, and it did this to the oscilloscope. That is bottom-up thinking. That's the same way I think. Concepts are learned with specific examples. It's also the same way an expert program learns how to diagnose disease.
Yeah.
It's the same exact way. Top-down thinkers overgeneralize. Oh, I fight this all the time in animal behavior class. They'll say, what do I do about cat behavior issues? Well, I don't know. What's a cat do? And I think the same thing is happening with autism, just a horrible overgeneralization. Okay, 3-year-olds that are not talking, I can give you a standard answer. Once I get older, I got to have a lot more information before I can give you any advice.
And the thing that you guys just said about how your talks have developed over the last 10 years, I think one myth that was really hard on parents was that oh, if we miss the window, then my child will not develop. But I think
we show that's not true.
Right, exactly. The autistic growth trajectory is lifelong.
No, you keep growing. As you add more and more information to the database, then you can think about things more nuanced. Okay, when I was a little kid, cats and dogs, put them in separate categories. I sorted them by size. And then we got a dachshund in the neighborhood. So then I had to figure out why she wasn't a dog. So, okay, she smelled like a dog, she barked like a dog. So I had to find attributes that she shared with dogs. And then you start learning more and more examples. Take felines, for example. You got the big cats, lions and tigers, and you got house cats, and you can make them tabbies and blacks, and then you got the special breeds, Siamese and Burmese. You can start, as I get more and more examples of cats, I can get more nuanced ways of looking at them and put them in smaller and smaller categories.
Those cats all dream of eating us. That's a thing that sets them apart from the rest.
Are there, what's the lessons for our schools in your experience? What should our schools be doing to accommodate or to embrace the
they
different
need to
ways?
put all the hands-on stuff back in, like art, theater, welding, sewing, cooking, all that stuff back in.
And don't give the kids any of those drugs they sang about in Jefferson Airplane songs and make them shrink because the cats will eat them.
John, you're worried about the cats.
Yeah, I would worry about the cats. Yeah.
John, can you share a little bit about your work, your policymaking work? What are our public institutions doing or thinking about with respect to the neurodiverse population? What are they paying attention to?
Here is one really important thing that I hammer upon in my government service. I serve on the committee that produces a strategic plan for autism for the U.S. government, and I've also served on steering committees for autism committees for the World Health Organization. And our committee produces some of the questions that we wish to answer and research, both into education, into medical issues of autism, services for autistic people. And I take the very strong position that this is our community. And if you wish to have a dialogue about how we are going to spend the government's money for the benefit of autistic people, whether that is to solve our medical problems or to provide housing support for us as adults or to help us make friends or get jobs and getting out of high school, the people who should be at the center of making those decisions are actual autistic people. And the people who should stand beside them would be the parents of autistic people and the caregivers, teachers, and other people who care for and love those of us in the community. But actual autistic people need to be in charge. And that is no more controversial than to suggest that if there was a pressing issue of concern to the Jewish community here in Boulder, you would not go ask the bishop in Denver what to do. You would ask the rabbis here. And when you think about it, the autistic population in America is roughly the same size as the Jewish population. And when we look at the respect accorded to Jewish people in America and the absence of respect shown to autistic people in the media, that shows you how far we need to go standing up for ourselves. But that is my main focus in my service with the U.S. government, to have autistic people take charge of our destiny and to focus all of our research and support efforts into output that will provide the best and better quality of life for autistic people.
One of the things that I think makes a good quality of life, I've worked over 20 years in construction. Sell that job, design that job. Right over there in Greeley and over there in Fort Morgan, the cattle are handled in equipment I designed. And some of the most fun stuff I had was in my work. And I'm seeing too many autism is a huge spectrum, going from intellectually impaired, nonverbal, to fully verbal. But on the fully verbal end of the spectrum, I'm seeing too many guys that aren't learning how to work. I worked with millwrights, and you have your car business. And that's
But disability was never an option when you and I were kids.
Yeah.
You and I had to grow up and work or starve.
But when I was 13, Mother got me a sewing job. And then I got kicked out of a regular high school at 14 for fighting. So Mother spent a lot of money to send me away to a special boarding school. You know what I did for the first 3 years? I rode horses and I ran the horse barn. I cleaned stalls every single day. And they also taught me how to be on time. And my parents were not that happy about that. And Mr. Patey, the headmaster, said, she let her get through her adolescence. But when I look back on that, I think the most important thing I learned is I learned how to work. And I'm seeing now this is a big problem. I think at 11 years old, when you start the work skills outside the home, it could be farmer's market, walk dogs for the neighbors, usher in a church or a synagogue where you get the congregation to shake hands with them, volunteer at the nursing home, instant illegal, and it's 14 in this state, a retail job, get a couple of real jobs under the belt, got to learn how to work. They got to learn how to do a task on a schedule for somebody else being the boss.
It was the same for me. At age 16, I joined a band and I went to work.
That's right.
And I never stopped. The idea that
you learned how to work, and I learned how to work.
The idea of disability, for people like Temple and I, it didn't exist in the 1960s and 70s. You went to work.
But then I started my freelance business when I was in high school, painting a sign for a beauty shop. And I had to make a sign the beauty shop wanted. And then I painted signs for the carnival. And then that morphed into my cattle business. And there's a scene in the movie where I walk up and I get the editor's card. I did that because when I was 8, I learned how to be party hostess. That's teaching those social skills. And I'm really pushing. I'm seeing too many kids. As I travel around talking at autism conferences, he's 18, I can't get him out of the bedroom, and he's never had a job. I'm also seeing problems with moms that can't let go. I think their identity gets hung up with being a special needs mom. Things like a fully verbal 13-year-old. These are examples in the last year or two. This is not ancient history. This is recent stuff. Fully verbal kid who had never gone in a store and bought something himself. And when I suggested to his mother that he'd go in a store and buy something, she broke down and started crying. Just couldn't let go. To do the most innocent stuff.
Is this something, Temple, you think needs to be part of school curriculum, or is this the responsibility of a family?
I think it needs to be part of school curriculum. We got to get them out there doing it, because what good is the algebra if they're playing video games on Social Security check? Because then, over there, way out there in meatpacking plant land, I know millwrights that own businesses, and they're on the spectrum. They're undiagnosed. They're my age and maybe 10 years younger. Own businesses. There's a whole shop full of hippies, it's not in the Colorado plants, but outside of the state, that run the maintenance shop. Straight out of the trailer park, got a job on the line, hated it, gravitated over to the maintenance shop. They're retiring now. They can't replace them. And there's tons of jobs in skilled trades. I'd say skilled trades is an appropriate job for Asperger's for about 25% of them. Not everybody, but for the kind of our kind of minds. But how are they going to get interested in a skilled trade if they don't get exposed to it? They're either going to love engines like you did, or they're going to think they're nasty and horrid. But I go back and forth between the cattle world and the meatpacking plant world and this world, and where a diagnosis helps is in relationships. My book, Different Not Less, I got 14 old Asperger's reviewed and telling their own stories, and the diagnosis helped them understand their relationship issues. I don't think it helps on the work issues. All of them had paper routes when they were 11, and I know that's gone. So we've got to find things to replace those paper routes.
One thing that Temple and I sort of typify is a lot of us don't fit into big organizations too well, but I think Temple and I both show that, and like the business owner she knows, we can do really well going out in the trades and owning our own business, and just doing.
You get in there, you get the gig done. It's called the gig now.
Just do
you get the job done. Get out of there before you get embroiled in their politics.
Because people don't really care what your social skills are. If you deliver a design for a stockyard, or you deliver a design
You
for a
deliver
building.
your sound effects
You
for the
make
bands.
that. Or even if you're a plumber and you just go clean someone's toilet, they don't care about your social skills. They want their toilet unclogged. And if you can do that, you can make a really good living. And you don't have to have those kinds of social skills that we autistic people so often lack.
And there were also large organizations in which there were divisions where social skills were not so important, like NASA, or like
Been there.
Right, or like the companies that built Silicon Valley. John and I were on a panel the other night for a wonderful program called Autism at Work, run by a giant software company called SAP. And I realized, okay, here we are, we're sitting in Silicon Valley. In the 80s, there were tons of people on the spectrum working in Silicon Valley.
Oh, yeah.
They just didn't have a label. And it was understood. There was a marriage and family therapist who wrote a book called Silicon Syndrome in the 80s, so this was before the Asperger syndrome label was introduced. And she talked about wives who are having problems with their husbands, who she called sci-tech men, who they had very few friends. The friends they did have were interested in their work. If there was a problem in the marriage, they sought data like Mr. Spock.
Yep.
And so she could have called that book Asperger Syndrome, but the label didn't, exist yet. But those were the people who were working in Silicon Valley and turned it into what it is now. So, I think there were places in some large organizations where you didn't have to have social skills.
Steve,
As long as you don't throw things.
Right.
NASA will fire you for throwing things. And I get over my anger issues. I had to switch from anger to crying. NASA space scientists cried when they shut down the space shuttle.
Wow.
You can look it up on 60 Minutes. That's one of the reasons why they kept those jobs.
Temple, did you learn that yourself, or did someone help you learn it?
After I still had to clean the horse barn, but riding got taken away for 2 weeks after a giant fight in the cafeteria. And somehow I switched to crying. I still got bullied. It was still awful. And the only places I was not bullied were the specialized interests. Riding horses, model rockets, and electronics. Those were refuges away from bullying. So I'm always saying, get the kid into robotics, get him into art, get him into band, get him into theater. Things where there's a shared interest with other students.
Somehow I didn't fight so much in school. I don't know why that is. I often wonder about that.
You might have looked big.
Well, one thing I think is that we talk about how autistic people are vulnerable to being picked on in fights. And I sometimes think that when I was a teenager and a young adult, I was a lot more autistic looking than I am today. I didn't have any facial expressions.
You keep learning. You keep learning.
And I was the same size when I was 21 that I am today. And I think that a guy my size without any expressions,
pretty
you kind
badass.
of, maybe you just leave him be and go pick on someone else.
I don't know what's up with him, but I'm not getting in his way.
And so, maybe autism protected me in that. One of the things I write about in my book, Switched On, is how if any of you read my brother's book, Running with Scissors, that book starts with this 35-year-old guy having sex with my brother when he's 13, and it's a kind of a shocking scene. Well, my brother's 8 years younger than me, and that guy was my best friend when I was 13. And he would tell me all about the joys of gay sex and the Romans and the Spartans and stuff. And I just would say to him, I just want to have a girlfriend. And nobody really ever tried to force themselves upon me in those years. And I often think, was my size and my autistic oblivion protective? And was my brother not afforded that protection by not being autistic? Because the outcomes in that case were really strikingly different, even though most people would think the autistic child is the vulnerable one, but I wasn't.
Steve, one of the things I was struck by after reading your book is that on the spectrum of sort of acceptance and understanding of neurodiversity, we're still in really early days. It strikes
Very
me.
much so. There was a guy at UCLA named Ed Ritvo who wrote a paper about autistic adults who got married, had jobs, and had families. This paper was published in 1986. Ritvo told me he was roundly ridiculed that for suggesting that that autistic adults get married and have jobs, have kids. That was like a completely new concept. Temple, I think, really pioneered the visibility of autistic adults in the world. And really still, like all through the 90s and early 2000s, autism was considered a child thing. You'd go to an Autism Speaks website and all you would see was pictures of children. And the whole concept that autistic adults can exist and have relationships and have jobs, we're still in the very, very early days of that. And so people say, like, why didn't these facilities exist before? Like, why didn't something like the Temple Grandin School exist before? And, some people say, well, that's because they're autistic people.
The school I went to, Hampshire Country School, was originally, if you looked at their brochure, it was for gifted kids with emotional problems. See, that was early 60s. So everything was emotional problems. But when I look back at fellow students at that school, I would say half of them were Asperger type students. And it was similar to some of the schools now. And a lot of those kids would have been autistic.
Right.
Everything in the 60s was considered emotional.
Right. Yeah, it was called an emotional disturbance. I mean, that came out of bad psychoanalytic thinking.
Well, that was all the analytic rubbish.
Yeah.
I mean, really, Temple and John, you were the first public role models for being a successful adult with autism. I mean, you are the sort of the vanguard.
And then I can think of all the people I worked with in skilled trades that I know were on the spectrum that had very, very good careers. And some of them own businesses. Those businesses are running right now. I can't go into any details about it because of confidentiality.
Temple, could I ask you a question, Temple?
Because they're not diagnosed, so I can't. Yeah.
Temple, what convinced you to become a public figure?
It happened gradually. Let me tell you how my first book, Emergence, got started. I was asked to do a few little programs for an educational thing for OTs called Continuing Education Programs of America. He had a friend that had a small publishing company called Academic Therapy, and they approached me about doing Emergence. In other words, it approached me. And that Bernard Rimland wrote an introduction to that book, and that said, it's kind of a groundbreaking book.
Yeah.
And then Oliver Sacks did his piece on me in early 90s, and then an agent, Patricia Brynan, came out of the woodwork and suggested I do Thinking in Pictures. It sort of came and got me.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way around. But what worries me today, I was 10 years of cattle industry before I did any advocacy. I'm seeing too many young kids wanting to be advocates that haven't even gotten a job yet. And autism advocacy is becoming their complete everything. Okay, your autism advocacy, again, later in life, you had a totally successful career, with nothing to do with autism. And I'm seeing kids getting so hung up on their autism, they're not developing other things. My main identity is professor of animal science and designer of equipment for the cattle industry.
One thing about this advocacy is I originally felt that it was important to be old enough to have had a range of life experiences to talk about. And I actually started like Temple gradually. When I was in my 30s, before I learned about being autistic, I was running my automobile business. And at that point, I was moderately successful. I was making a living. And I felt at that time that I should start speaking to teenagers that had been taken by the state for child abuse, sex abuse, for being in bad households, because I came to see that these homes for kids like that would have people coming and talking who'd say, well, I'm a fireman or I'm a policeman or whatever. Not many of them had people saying, I got abused just like you, and yet here I am, and I own a business today, and I got thrown out of high school just like you, and I'm okay now, and I'm making a living, and you can too. And I realized when I started to do that that was very important. But at the same time, that work was like secret. I never told people in the car business.
I did the same thing. When an emergence came out, I never disclosed.
I was ashamed of it.
I wasn't ashamed of it. I just didn't disclose. And then sometimes it leaked across. Then Oliver Sacks piece, but the movie, of course, blew everything wide open. But there would be some people in the industry that knew, but I won't. But basically, I never disclosed. I kind of lived in two parallel worlds. And then they gradually mixed together.
And that was what I did. And what actually then blew that open for me was in 2002. My brother wrote that Running with Scissors book about our childhood, and I offered the book for sale in our car company. And people would say, well, how come there's this book by this guy for sale? And the receptionist would say, oh, that's John's brother. And people would buy it. And at first I thought people were going to buy that book and they were going to be so disgusted at the stuff our family had done and had happen that they would never want to speak to me. And in fact, the result was so shocking. These respectable people in the community, they came in and they would be like crying and telling me they got raped in college, or they were respectable lawyers and they grew up in foster homes because their parents beat them up. And you would never in a million years guess that to see them today. And they said, it's so wonderful that you and your brother were willing to speak out about this stuff.
I had a similar thing happen, because even though I never disclosed, I remember going to a pork meatpacking plant, and the hog buyer had an autistic kid, and then they'd read Emergence, and we didn't talk about hogs at all. We spent an entire day talking about their son. And people start coming out of the woodwork and saying they had some of these problems.
And one thing interesting about Emergence that I mentioned in the book is that Bernie Rimland described the book as the first book by a recovered autistic person.
And that caused some controversy.
Right.
And I've made it very clear on things I've written since then that I just didn't know any better.
Right. Well, also, he couldn't conceive of an autistic person with a PhD, basically. Like, that wasn't part of the model yet, And so that's how new the idea of autistic professional
That came out, I think it was 86 that came out.
Yeah.
Well, and one part of the activism, it seems to me, that you were commenting on, Temple, of a younger generation, comes partially out of the fact that people on the spectrum are forming their own communities now. And I wonder, Steve, if you could tell the story of Alex Plank in Wrong Planet.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, John could probably almost tell the story better. But Alex and his buddy Dan Grover, they were teenagers, and they were looking at websites for autistic people, and they were either really for parents, or they were totally lame, and as Alex puts it. And so they wanted some place that was cool. I have to say, Alex Plank was the first autistic hipster I ever met. I had in writing articles for Wired about autism, a lot of the autistic people I'd met, they were in medicalized contexts, they were in a clinic or, maybe in a school. But I met Alex Plank at a conference called Autreat that was run by autistic for autistic people. So Alex is this good-looking blonde guy. I see him stepping out of a Range Rover with super.
That was when he went there with Cubby.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it was my Range Rover.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so I see these incredibly handsome, young autistic guys, and we ended up going out to dinner that night. It was I felt like I was seeing a new generation of young autistic people who, they were definitely autistic, but they were really hip and really funny, and they didn't. Their whole lives weren't defined around autism. They loved their special interests. They liked their community. They were with girls, I believe. They
were.
And they were happening, And so when Alex and Dan were teenagers, and by the way, when I met Alex, I knew him because I had been reading about his career in the online world because of this. So they get together, they decide to form a website that doesn't suck, basically, for people like them. And it was called Wrong Planet. And they wrote a press release. It was amazingly professional. And so it was like, what news guy wouldn't want to write about this website written or created by these two autistic teenagers? Like, they had their marketing down, they had their technology down, and that was how Wrong Planet got started.
When he met them, Alex was living with us up in western Massachusetts. It's funny, he met me when I started writing about and speaking publicly about autism, which happened after my brother's book in 2002, because Running with Scissors had a chapter about me, the autistic brother, and that's when I got started speaking out in public. But Alex, we kind of adopted him, and so I guess I can take credit for his current love of Land Rovers and Jaguars and stuff.
Though that touches on, I think, a really important subject, which is I think you modeled autistic adulthood for Alex, like you were a role model. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that autistic adults do disclose if they're in a situation where they can, so that autistic young people have visible role models who are in the media and who have jobs.
I have a lot of kids write to me all the time, and I always send them cards back and encouragement. And
I'm sure it means the world to them.
Yeah,
that's right.
We really, and that's something for all of you to think about, because I can't tell you how many people say to me that this autism in their kid, they don't know where it came from, and it came out of nowhere. And in fact, when I was diagnosed with autism, I had no idea that there were other autistic people in my family. And I saw that my son had some traits of autism, but it was some years before I realized that my son's autistic too. And it was only after my father died.
you wrote about the engineering genes and autism.
Yeah.
That Wired article.
My stepmother called me up after my father died, and she said, "John Elder, I just read this book of yours, and don't you think your father had this Asperger thing too?" And of course, the shameful thing is when I was a little boy, my grandparents would say, "You stay away from your cousin Malcolm and some of these other cousins of yours, because they're deaf and dumb and they're idiots and they'll butt you and they'll bite you." And I, of course, wanted to go see what they were about. So I would go see these cousins of mine, and some of them would butt me and bite me, and we'd knock each other down, but we, became friends. And now I realized that deaf and dumb was a 1960s term for non-speaking autistic. And the thing that I always keep in mind now in my advocacy for autistic people, you might wonder, where are these deaf and dumb cousins of mine today? They're all dead. And not only are they dead, my cousin Little Bob, who every day in the summer, we took him to the child guidance clinic that is now the Emory Autism Center in Atlanta, and he's dead too. And I realized that autistic people, we don't know why we are at greater risk of mortality than other people. But those cousins of mine,
heart problems.
Well,
and seizures. Seizures are the leading cause of death.
Seizures, but also heart problems. I've got a murmur. You just told me you have a heart problem.
But we don't know why we have that. And so one of the things I push hard for in my government service is for us to study the medical issues that we have to confront as older autistic people.
Gastrointestinal
intestinal trouble, because that is really not understood, and it's a big concern.
That's one of the things that came bottom up to me in writing my book, was that I kept seeing the gastrointestinal issues come up throughout history. And I was skeptical about that when I started writing the book. But that was a bottom-up thing that I definitely
it's a real
saw.
thing.
And then you do a Google search, scholar search, and you'll find out there's a whole bunch of papers on it. There's a Dr. Bluey in Boston, B-L-U-I.
My son and his mother, the thing is, a lot of us have had intestinal problems, like we have to go to the bathroom a lot, and and we have maybe pain that comes to us often. But if it's been with us all our lives, how do we know it's not normal? It's just like when I wrote "Look Me in the Eye." People would say, "Look me in the eye." How could I know that my way of looking you in the eye was not the way it is for everyone else? Now I know it thanks to knowing about autism.
I want to make a comment about nonverbal. There's some books out there by nonverbal people who type completely independently. One of my favorites is Tito Makapadehe, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? There's a little Japanese boy, The Reason I Jump. That's coming out with a sequel this summer. He's 24 years old. He types completely independently. You'll get a lot of insight in how he thinks, and it's got a title, kind of strange title, like
Fall
stand
down
up
6
seven,
times,
yeah,
get up 7 or something?
Stand up 7 times, fall down 8 times, something like that.
Yeah.
And that's coming out this summer. It's a much better book than The Reason I Jump. And those 2 books will give you a lot of insight, because there's some people that look very low functioning and very handicapped that can learn how to type, and they can't control some of their movements. So it's important when you teach them if you teach them with an iPad, because the print's got to appear next to the keyboard. Can't do attention shift. So Tito prefers just to type on a piece of paper that's got the keyboard written on it.
Well, one thing that I think we're really learning is that standard measures of IQ and stuff do not work so well with autistic people, because the tests are biased.
Well, and the thing, they're different. Like, I did really well in the block design, but then there's somebody else on the spectrum who's more of a verbal thinker.
Right,
there tends to be uneven skills.
Right.
My ability in art showed up in 3rd grade, and fortunately my mother always encouraged that, and I was encouraged to do lots of different kinds of art. See, this gets back to learning how to work. I'm seeing a lot of people that are really good at art, but they haven't been taught to do art on assignment. Not, maybe they want pictures of dogs or something.
Right. One of the things that I found for the book that blew my mind, actually, was that a colleague of Hans Asperger's named Annie Frankel wrote or Annie Weiss at that point, wrote a paper in the mid-1930s where she saw a kid who we would now call autistic, and she gave him a standard intelligence test. And he didn't do well, but instead of just saying, like, he's not very intelligent, she said, there's something about the way this kid thinks where our tests are broken, actually. Like, they're not measuring intelligence of this kind of kid accurately. And that was an amazingly prescient thing to be thinking in the mid-1930s.
Has there been an evolution, Steve, then in how we test or evaluate?
I know there's a lot of scrutiny now about how standardized tests are basically slanted against the way autistic people think. I don't know of any special autistic intelligence tests or whatever. Yeah.
How is popular culture doing in creating role models? I mean,
Well, Temple's a huge role model.
So the HBO movie out in the world, Sesame Street, has just introduced a autistic character named Julia.
That was designed with the help of autistic adults from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think Sheldon on The Big Bang
And he claims he doesn't have Asperger's, but I don't agree with that. When I went to the Emmys, I think Jim Parsons has got some Asperger's because he has, and I think so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so. And then when he was at the Golden Globes, I think someone coached him. See, and this brings up the whole thing that social skills have to be taught, like being in a foreign country. This is rude pointing in China. You point like that. Now just think about it. All social skills have to be taught like you're teaching somebody in a foreign country.
Yeah. Well, that Big Bang guy said in an interview that he got insights into autistic behavior from reading Look Me in the Eye.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that he said he modeled some of his behaviors on the behaviors I described.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think of what popular culture is doing with neurodiversity and people on the spectrum? Is it good?
Well,
Is
one
it
thing
bad?
that there are not enough yet is there are not enough autistic people of color role models in media. And in fact, there were not enough autistic people of color in that video, I'm afraid to say. But, one of the things that people say to me all the time is, isn't autism being overdiagnosed now? Aren't we just slapping labels on geeky kids? Well, in minority communities, it's still underdiagnosed. There are still problems with access to diagnostic resources and visible role models. You hardly ever see autistic people of color in media.
I think the other thing that we have to be cognizant of is that that we are talking here about relatively bright, maybe less impaired autistic people who can talk. There are still a significant number of autistic people who are much more impaired in adulthood than either Temple or I.
Well, I totally agree with that, and I think the problem is how the diagnostic criteria has changed. Nobody's taking the diagnostic criteria for tuberculosis and changing that. In the 80s, you had to have speech delay along with the autistic symptoms. Then in the early 90s, Asperger's was added as a separate category, basically the socially awkward without obvious speech delay. Then in 2013, it got all merged together. So now you've got the same word being used for this huge spectrum.
And that's really because, as a very honest psychiatrist once put it to me, the DSM, or the big Bible of psychiatry, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, he said, the DSM is not really about mental health, it's about reimbursement. And so putting it all under the autism spectrum disorder umbrella, it's like one code.
That's right, and they have to get that code to get the services.
Right, exactly.
But I think it is still true that autistic people with really severe impairments remain invisible. And I think it is an unfortunate truth that if I were to ask any of you who the 5 brightest people you know are, every one of you can name the 5 smartest people. If I asked you, who are the 5 least smart people, not people that you just say angrily, he's a dumbass or a fool, but who are the people you truly think have the lowest IQ of anyone you know in your life? And most of you have no idea who those people are. And I think that the people at the bottom 1, 2, 3% of the function range have always been invisible. But I think those of us who are more articulate, who are part of the autism community, we have a duty to speak up for our brothers and sisters who are not able to speak up. And we need to ensure that when we call for services and assistance, that we recognize that there are people who need very different kinds of help than, say, Temple or I or others may need. And it may even seem that those people need things that are mutually exclusive to what we would ask for. And that's a hard thing for the public to comprehend.
Well, so I think the thing that I find is hard is when people think in words overgeneralize. And I'm finding the same problem when I'm talking to people about horse behavior and dog behavior. People tend to overgeneralize. And having this big wide spectrum is making this overgeneralizing problem way worse. I think even though books are out, like the Reason I Jump, and it's a gigantic bestseller, and the Tito Macapade's book, it had a hard time believing that they can look so handicapped and have a mind inside there. That's why I think it's so important, the ones that can learn how to type, to learn how to type. And why aren't more people doing it? You can do it with a plain old tablet that you can find in somebody's closet somewhere.
That's true, but we also have to recognize as a society that even if someone can't write a brilliant book if they get access to an iPad, that their life still has value.
That's right. That's right.
One thing about Temple and I is I think that as older autistic people, we don't sound very disabled when we talk, and yet I think it's safe to say that both of us retain significant components of disability in our lives. But I think for me, and likely for Temple, I could never have spoken to you when I was 20 years old. So had you looked at me at age 10 or 15 or 20, you would have absolutely seen a pretty significantly disabled teenager. And
that'd be the same thing with me. You see, and you keep learning.
The picture you see of us today is not representative of what you would have seen of us at the age of the students in the Temple Grandin School.
So let me ask this then before I invite some questions from the audience. What advice would each of you give to neurodiverse individuals who
All right,
are
let's put
younger
it-
to get to, have as much success and fulfillment in life as you've had?
What age of neurodiverse individual?
Let's say a high school student.
All right, okay. Want me to start?
Please.
Okay, I'm going to assume a fully verbal one. The first thing I was, develop your strengths, whether it be art, math, programming, writing, whatever it is. And the other thing is, they've got to learn how to work. I hate to keep bringing that up, but I'm seeing too many where they graduate from high school sometimes with honors, graduate from college with honors, and they've never held jobs.
And Temple, I hear you say that it's not so much about skills, it's about work ethic.
They've got to have work ethic, and you've got to do assignments other people want. It gets back to the first sign I ever made. Beauty shops were not high on my list of interest. But that's the sign that the customer wanted. That's doing the assignment for the client.
And of course, that's a lesson that'll apply to anybody.
Well, yeah, and I'm seeing today social skills are taught in a much less rigid way. The reason why those millwrights have successful metal fabrication businesses is from my generation, the social skills were taught in a much more rigid way. And they probably had paper routes when they were young.
I would just second the emphasis on social skills in our high school program and in my college teaching at William and Mary now. I see that most kids come out of high school today and they do not know the social behaviors that are necessary to keep a job. They don't realize that when you come into work, if the trash is overflowing, you go empty it. You don't just ignore it and take your phone out of your pocket and look at a game. And I think that we have such a disconnect between the kids of today and the manners and social skills that are needed to get and keep a job.
And the thing is, it hurts the autistic kid more than it hurts the normal
Yes,
kid.
autistic kids, we are already socially disabled. We have, by definition, if you're autistic, you have a difficult time reading other people. Well, if you can't read other people and you're rude as hell too, you've got nothing going for you in an employment or school interview setting. But if you're really polite, if you sweep the snow off cars, if you hold the doors for people, if you say yes sir and yes ma'am, you don't have to read body language to be polite. You just have to learn a set of rules. And if you can teach yourself that, you'll create the impression in other people that you're a nice kid. And then if you do something weird, because we're autistic, they're more likely to cut you some slack. But if you don't learn those skills, you are absolutely nowhere. And I didn't know that until later in life. And when I learned about autism and I learned about changing my behavior, and I learned, not only could I learn to be polite, but I could also teach myself, for example, not to get right next to you when I talk to you and make you feel menaced. And I have learned not to turn away from you and look in a book when you're talking to me because you'll be insulted thinking I'm ignoring you. I don't have to read your body language to learn those skills either. And that kind of stuff was powerfully transformational for me in a good way. And we need to be teaching that to all students in high school, but particularly
I would agree with
autistic kids absolutely have to learn that for success.
Like being in a foreign country.
Yeah, and we're not talking here, I want to be clear, about teaching autistic people to pretend to be something they're not. For example, what I would say to you is you can always look at her, you can say, oh, that's a really pretty blue dress you have there. And she will always smile at you. But if you look at her the next day and your thought is, you look like a circus animal in that red and white striped thing and you should go home and change it, you just keep your mouth shut. So I'm not telling you to be a liar. Don't say you look really beautiful in every shirt or every dress. If you want to say something like that that's nice, go ahead and say it. But if you're going to say something that will get you in trouble, just keep your mouth shut. My father and my grandfather really always taught me that I would never get in trouble keeping my mouth shut. And that's really true. And so many autistic people never learn that.
Well, I'm not autistic, but I'm just a boring neurotypical. But when I think about a message that I could send to people in high school, when I was in high school, I was a little chubby gay kid. I was bullied all the time. I thought I would grow up to have a completely lonely life. I would never find a partner. It seemed inconceivable. Now I'm still chubby, but I'm incredibly happily married. And that happened because I gained confidence in myself by finding other members of my tribe. So now there are student groups that are starting at colleges like William and Mary, and in fact, I talked to your neurodiverse student group there. It's really important to find other members of your tribe, to believe in yourself, and also to work for the rights that you deserve. And so the fact that I'm happily married is not just that I grew up, it's that people like me fought for their rights and ultimately changed both people's minds about what being gay is, because I was sent to a therapist for the cure by my parents in high school. So the world changed, policy changed, opportunities changed, and I couldn't have gone through any of that if I hadn't had some belief in myself that was really inspired by meeting other members of my tribe.
And of course, the establishment of neurodiversity and autistic student groups in high school and college is the modern day equivalent of what you're talking about, of having a gay, for you to go to college and have a gay student group or a professor who says, I'm gay, and it's okay, and there's other gay people here, and that's like such a liberating thing. Well, we're doing that very same thing, but with autism today. And I see the exact same liberating effect on autistic students today by being around other autistic people.
And I think that's a really good thing. But I travel around, do a lot of talks like at public school things to teachers, and unfortunately I'm seeing too many video game addicts having very bad outcomes, too many recluses in the room. We have got to fight that. Get them out, get them in robotics club, get them in theater. I'm pushing things like theater and skilled trades because artificial intelligence is not going to wipe those things out. and I'm seeing them not getting stretched. Mother knew how to stretch me. You don't chuck these kids in the deep end of the pool, but you got to stretch. I just got an example the other day of a girl who got chucked into the deep end of the pool of Christmas rush at a Gap type store. No, that's retail bucking bronco. That's not the way to do it. You might be able to work into the Christmas rush, but you start out when the store is calmer. But I'm seeing too many of them where they're not learning basic skills, and especially you get out in some of the rural areas, they're not having good outcomes. And so I'm just pounding away at the working skills. You've also got to remember, I come from a little bit different background. Construction affects how I think. Sell that job, design that job, supervise the construction, start that job up. And if that kid gets out and he gets a great job and he's happy in that job, then we've succeeded. And that's sort of my thinking. And it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that I realized how much building things affects how I think.
I'm going to see if we have some questions from the audience. Jen and Leanne, I don't know if we have microphones we can hand around. Is that a yes? Yeah. Fantastic. Well, if anyone would like to ask any questions, please raise your hand. We've got some mics going around, but feel free to join the discussion. Anyone?
There's one there.
Oh, there's a hand up in the... Okay.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. So I have 2 sons with autism. One is 9 years old, one is 7 years old, and then there's a little sister as well. And they couldn't be more different from each other, but they both hate school. And we can only afford public school, which is a great public school. It's Boulder Valley School District. They do a lot to accommodate. And in general, I feel that everybody's very kind towards them. It's really very, very lucky for somebody who puts their kids to public school. But in the mornings, they line up in front of
the first thing we got to do is figure out why they hate school. Okay, I want to bring up something about, I'm going to call it troubleshooting. I want to totally trash the medical model. and start systematically questioning exactly what the problem at the school is that's making him hate school.
I've tried to do that.
Okay.
And he seems to be right. He's very logical, and everything he says just seems like he's right. I always end up in the corner saying, yeah, you are right.
Does he
Like
hate
says,
every subject in school?
He just hates the lack of freedom he has there. He hates the fact that it's a bit of a cattle call. Even though he's in every accommodation you can think of, but he is under-challenged mentally.
Okay, so in other words, he's bored.
Well, yeah, he wants
All right,
to build
well, okay, so let's get the laptop with more difficult math on it, and let's say, I'm not saying put a third grader in high school, but give them more challenging work, and you can do it on a laptop. The programs are free. It's called Khan Academy and edX, and it's got the right price, it's free.
I mean, I think they've really done a great job accommodating that. For
but
me,
he may be bored. You see, this is where he may be bored in math, and if you bore him in math, you turn him into behavior problems. He needs to be given more challenging work, and he can just do it on a laptop there at his desk.
But how do I answer his question, like, why do I have to do it now, and why do I have to do it here, when I know that our house is across the street? And that's what he says, I want to go home. I go on Khan Academy in my bedroom. And
but I don't want him in the bedroom. He needs the social of school.
No,
they need the social of school. And sometimes you also have to do a certain amount of stuff you don't really like. Now, he's not getting bullied. Okay, let's make sure that something genuinely bad is not happening at school, like bullying.
No, they actually like him. I
Good.
really have the feeling that
maybe they could find some other things for him to do. I want to dig down and find exactly.
So I guess
it boredom? What is the problem?
What it boils down to, there is a point where I have to tell him, you just have to do it.
You do have to go.
You know, I go insane if I homeschool you, and you just have to do it.
Well, you can't.
And you just arrive at a place where there's no more answers, where you just, sorry, it starts at 8.
Well, sometimes you have to do things. I was a kid that the normal high school did not work. Now, as far as homeschooling a high school kid, homeschool a fully verbal high school kid, they better get a job. And why am I pushing the job stuff so much? Because I worked with so many dyslexic, ADHD. How about a guy who stutters, ADHD, horrible student, probably autistic, owns a metal fabrication company, and a very good one. Get him out working.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you can't do that with 7-year-olds. But you see, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to dig down, and I have to do the same thing on dog and cat behavior problems. You got to dig down and see exactly where the problem is. You might have a sensory issue at the school where he can't stand the sound of the fluorescent lighting, and that's driving him crazy. And sensory issues are very real. They're very variable. Some kids have visual problems. Other kids have sound sensitivity problems. So if you have a sensory issue in the classroom, that can really be bad, and that needs to be fixed. But you see, I've got to figure out what the problem is. Exactly what the problem is.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Nicole, you have someone over there?
Hi, I'm an adult on the spectrum. My significant other is an adult on the spectrum, and I'm wondering where you guys feel the impact of stigma stands. How does it impact a child? So there's 50,000 youth that...
I dealt with stigma, be the very best I could be. I'd whip the drawings out. And I can remember people looking at me and going, oh, you did that, you weird, awful thing, you did that. Get really good at something. Get really good at something. People respect talent. There's a scene in the movie where the lady liked my shirt and I got into the meat packing plant. That scene was real. That was a shirt I had hand embroidered. I was wearing my portfolio. I didn't realize it. I learned a long time ago, getting my business started, starting back with a hairdressing sign. You sell jobs with your portfolio. What do you do? What do you do professionally?
I'm a neurodiversity advocate.
maybe you need to get some other thing to do in addition to that.
Well, what
where
do you
can
do
show off-
actually? Like, how do you are you able to make a living doing it? Because I know neurodiversity advocates who work on public policy in Washington. That's really important.
I'm the founder of a company called Sexy Genius, and we represent a platform for adults on the spectrum, specific services strictly just for adults.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
That's cool.
John, did you have a similar experience? Or
Well, I think that, like Temple
They
says...
like your car stuff that you do.
Yeah, the
They
cars...
liked all the things you made for KISS. They liked that.
People absolutely now, I think that my work speaks for me, whether it's my cars, my electronic creations, or my writings. But so I think that when you asked all about the stigma of feeling like we are stupid or defective or less than other people, that really was with me. It's still, there's some of it with me even today. The thing that was a big deal for me is when I got involved after writing my first book in autism research. People began to ask me to take part in studies and to I got to know these researchers at Harvard Medical School. And one of the fellows there said that he particularly wanted to meet me because he read the story of in Look Me in the Eye, where I talk about how I wanted to get a regular job. And Milton Bradley wanted to hire an engineer to design sound effects, but it was digital electronics. And I didn't know anything about digital electronics. I only knew about analog electronics. But I said to myself, well, how hard can it be? I'll just study it for a couple of weeks and I'll go and present myself as a digital engineer. And so people said to me that that was just bullshit. And I just, lied and got a job. And I always felt that I wasn't real because of what people said to me. And so when I talked to, so Alvaro said, when he read that, he saw that as a classic description of an autistic savant behavior. And at the time, I didn't know what that was. And he said that a typical person would not think it's possible for someone to learn the skills to do digital engineering in a few weeks. But he said, clearly, if it was bullshit, you would have failed, right? And he said, he said, what's in your book is true, isn't it? It's all in the public domain.
Well, in your portfolio, did you get patents on that stuff?
Well, we had patents.
All right, you've got those. They're on the patent office to show people.
And so I have a history of doing those things, and it was successful. And as Alvaro said, there's no way I would have been successful if I didn't have the underlying skill. So he said that it may be that no one knows how I could acquire the skills. But the fact is I did it.
But the thinking is different.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with me. But then I just take out the pictures and the drawings, and I've got a lot of papers on Google Scholar, and I've got my books. It's putting the work out there. I've learned a long time ago to sell my work and not myself. I can remember in my 20s taking out these big drawings and just showing them to people.
And I guess I've come to realize now that the work, those are real accomplishments.
Yes, they are.
And nobody can say that just because I couldn't go to school or I couldn't do certain things, that they don't count. They do count.
They do.
They're all out there in the world doing their job. And I think that it can be very hard for us to overcome being told that we're dirt as kids. And I think that it's hard sometimes to say, well, we could be measured by what we do. And I think that it's very hard for a young person who can't say, well, this is what I've done because it's too young to have.
Well, I have a book called Asperger's and Self-Esteem that I wrote. Actually, it's Norm Legend has a book. I wrote the foreword for it. I encouraged Norm Legend to do the book. Famous scientists and musicians that were on the spectrum. I have in Thinking in Pictures, I have a chapter on Einstein and Van Gogh and other artists and people that I think were on the spectrum. I went and looked at biographies to look at their early childhood. And Edison's another one. I just read a biography on him recently, telling kids, hey, look at this person. Leonardo da Vinci was real super weird, and some other people like this. Steve Jobs had his weirdness. That there were some pretty famous people in the past that probably were on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. This all starts, though, in childhood. And I learned something from one of my colleagues at William & Mary that really speaks to this powerfully. Warrenetta Mann is our head of counseling at William & Mary. And one day I looked at her and I thought, she's poised and elegant, and she's got a doctorate from a top university, and she's worked all her life at the best universities in the country, and William & Mary came and courted her and hired her for a prestigious job. And she has a very strong, positive self-image. And look at me, I flunked out of every school after the Mulberry Tree Nursery School. I've had a terrible self-image. And I said, what's wrong with this picture? Because I'm the tall white male and you're the short black female. And I realized that both of us grew up under the ending of segregation in the South. And both of us had people say hateful, ugly stuff to us. But the difference is, Warrenetta could go home and she could tell her parents what people said to her. And they could say, Warrenetta, honey, those are ugly, racist lies. And the fact is, these are our leaders in the black community right here in town. And these are our pastors and our undertakers and our business leaders. These are the great men and women, and you're going to be one someday. And these are our leaders in Washington. And these are the leaders in other countries. And this is our culture that goes back thousands of years. And then you contrast that with me when I go home and I'm crying and I tell my mother and father about the kids telling me I'm stupid and I'm retarded and I'm no good. And what does she say? Well, son, you come from a long line of little boys that bang their heads through doors and smear their poo on walls, but I'm sure you're going to be fine. And the thing is, nobody knows. Nobody knew about this autism thing. Well, because Warrenetta was bullied because of her skin, her parents could know it and they could defend it. My parents couldn't defend it. So that's why it is so vitally important that all of you who are parents of young kids with autism, that you recognize that the apple does not fall far from the tree. And maybe you yourselves do not have autism diagnoses, but perhaps you can recognize that this fixation that your kid has, and it's why he's failing.
I just want to make get a little word in here. I tell parents, I've been to the Googleplex.
Yeah, me too.
They're mostly all on the spectrum. I worked with some brilliant tradespeople I know are on the spectrum. I've been interviewed by reporters I know are on the spectrum. You wouldn't have that iPhone if it wasn't for people on the spectrum. That's the kind of stuff I'd chuck back in their face.
Mm-hmm. And you got to stand up for difference in kids. If you parents stand up for your kids and you say, son, this thing that they say is a disability in you, it's why I'm a successful lawyer, it's why I'm a good engineer, it's why I'm a meticulous builder. If you can do that, you're going to build community, and we're going to have strong young autistic people, just as Warrenetta's parents and a generation of parents created a culture of strong, proud African American people in this country. We can do that with autistic people.
One of the main reasons why I wrote my book was to give autistic people a sense of their own history, that they had a history they could be proud of, that went back to, in my book, Henry Cavendish, who made many of the great scientific discoveries of the 18th century, and was really autistic. He was quite significantly impaired. But it's really important that I felt that autistic people have a sense of themselves as a people moving together into the future, not just a diagnostic label.
Why don't we take one or two more questions and we'll wrap up.
G'day, my name's Josh. I'm from Australia. My question is this. You gave some street tips about what people with autism should do, how they should advocate for themselves. What about neurotypicals? What are some street tips or some advice you would give, maybe one each? Really important.
I'll give some for employers.
I'm a school teacher,
Okay.
but parents, friends, advocating. I'm a school teacher advocating for other students, the neurotypicals, with their friends who have autism.
When I was in the 3rd grade, fortunately I was not bullied in elementary school. And one of the reasons for that is my 3rd grade teacher was the head teacher for the school. When I was not there, explained to the other children that a handicap that was not visible, like a wheelchair, and that if I made social mistakes, they need to explain to me how I should behave. On my very first building project, I criticized some welding, and I said it looked like a pigeon had doo-dooed on it. And what the plant engineer did, and he did exactly the right thing, pulled me into his office in private and said I had to apologize for that rude talk. He told me what I should do. You can't do a bunch of vague stuff like he's not a team player. For employers and teachers, avoid long strings of verbal information. Don't remember it. Any task that requires sequence, give them a pilot's checklist so you don't load the working memory. But you cannot be vague. When social mistakes are made, you need to explain to them what they did wrong. Just calmly and totally not vague. In the workplace, you need to be told just what's expected. Don't say just develop new software. You got to tell them you got to do this language, this platform, this, and the outcome is some very specific thing and get it done in 3 weeks. And here's the deadline, where it's clear.
I think that's part of, remember, it's just like telling that girl that she looks like a zoo animal in that red and white striped dress. You just don't say your welding job looks like a bird pooped on it. You don't say your dress makes you look like a freak.
Well, and I went up and I was told to go up to the cafeteria and apologize, and I did. And he didn't scream and yell at me. He just pulled me in private and very quietly told me what I should do. Also, that if I didn't like his welding, since Whitey the welder was his employee, I should have come to him first to talk about some problems with the welding.
I think it's worth pointing out that you hear these stories from us and they sound funny. And I agree they sound funny today. But Temple and I are both smart people. And we looked at the dresses, the welding, these other things in our lives, and it was our true, honest belief that we were providing correct commentary that was relevant.
I was in my 20s when I did that.
We were grown-ups providing what we thought was true commentary, and we now realize it was very socially inappropriate. Doesn't make it untrue, but we know now not to say that. And if we can make that mistake, any other person can. So don't be thinking that this is a joke, because it's not. It's a big, big deal for young autistic people.
One bit of advice I would give to neurotypical people about interacting with autistic people is don't assume that the deficits are all on the autistic side. Because, for instance, autistic people are, they have a hard time reading social signals. Well, we have a hard time reading the social signals on body language and facial expressions of autistic people. And I remember going to have coffee with someone who befriended me online, an autistic man. And I sat there and he looked really unhappy, and I thought, oh my God, this is terrible. This is not a good coffee. This didn't work out. And then I got back home and he said, that was great. When can we do that again? And I realized that I was actually not very good at reading autistic facial expressions and body language. So have some humility.
If you guys want a constructive suggestion too about reading body language, there's a book written by an FBI agent, Joe Navarro, who was a senior profiler and an interrogator in the FBI. And it's called What Everybody is Saying. It's a book from 7 or 8 years ago. It has a lot of really good practical advice about reading body language.
Another great little book. It's a book for training teenagers in retail. It's called Smile for Success for Teenagers. A little book with a bright blue cover. Smile for Success for Teenagers.
Nicole, did you have a last question over there, or
We'll take one more, and then we'll break for our reception downstairs, where more discussion can continue.
Should I stand up? Okay. All right. Okay, this is more of a science question than a question about the current social situation of autism. But is it known where the autistic condition comes from, and if so, has it been documented in species besides humans?
Well, I mean, it's documented in species. You know, you can read a million headlines in the newspaper about autistic mice in study. You know, really? It's like, it's a complex...
Mice with traits of autism are created by humans. That's not something...
But it's not the same as autistic mice.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so, yes, autism is understood to be primarily, but not exclusively, genetic.
Yes.
So primarily, yes, but you can also have two identical twins where one is autistic and one is not.
But the concordance rate, I think, is 88%.
Right, it's very high. So the genetic role is unquestionable, but there also appears to be some epigenetic thing going on, an interaction between the genes and the environment in the womb that is what creates autism.
So there is evidence that a condition like autism exists in monkeys and other primates, and there is suggestive evidence that something like that may exist in some dogs and other animals. Now, we wouldn't necessarily call those things autism, because autism is defined in large part in humans through speech, and those creatures do not speak in a way we recognize or understand to evaluate. But autism may reach beyond humanity. And if you wish to read the latest findings of science like that, I would invite any of you to follow our government autism committee. We're called the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. We are online at IACC for Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, .hhs for Health and Human Services, .gov for U.S. government. Every year, we publish a summary of the most significant advances in autism research, and you can go to our website and read those advances going back a decade. We also publish the strategic plan, which includes the questions we want to have answered in research, some of which speak to what you just asked, and you can read those going back a number of years. And you can also look at all the presentations to our committee, which have included autistic-like behavior in primates. And you can see
I want to add some animal research stuff that I think kind of backs up this idea of normal variation. I found some papers on dogs and wolves. What is the difference? We've bred the dog to be hypersocial. That's why they're easy to train. These are papers that are about 3 years old. If a wolf watches another wolf open up a puzzle box, it's got food in it. The other wolf will watch and open it. But the domestic dog's are busy like looking at us. Yeah. He doesn't open the puzzle box. So basically a brain can be more social or a brain can be more cognitive. I also found a paper on looking at some of the characteristics of solitary animals like panthers and leopards as opposed to a more social animal like lions or a more social cat. So in the animal kingdom, there's differences between more cognitive brain or a more social brain. And so I think in the mild forms of autism, that's just another indicator that I think it's just normal a variation. Obviously, speech delay is not normal. But when I found those papers, those were a big light bulb, and I've got them in my animal behavior talks.
And perhaps we should give the final word on neurodiversity in animals to Lorna Wing, the mother of the autism spectrum. She was the cognitive psychiatrist who sort of resurrected Asperger's concept of the autistic continuum. And she once said to me, all dogs have ADHD and all cats have Asperger's syndrome.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that.
Well, that's a great final note. Thank you for your questions. as we wrap up, I want to invite everyone to join us downstairs in the cafe where there'll be more beverages and discussion, and our panelist books are available for sale and signature, and they'll also be available to chat more. So please help me to thank them for spending their time with us tonight. Thank you very much. And we'll see you all downstairs. Thank you.